Hello, friends. Welcome back to Unmuted Love. I'm C. Eshelman, your host and trust repair specialist for parents of children who experienced early trauma. I am so glad you are here today with me because you are in for a treat. We're going to attack something your child might be struggling with, and that's learning difficulties through the lens of my guest today, Ruth Rumack, founder and executive director of Ruth Rumack's Learning Space. She's a reading specialist and educator who spent 30 years helping striving readers and their families navigate the emotional and academic impact of reading difficulties. Her work focuses on the connection between learning, emotional safety, which you all are familiar with, self-worth, and identity, particularly how children begin to internalize shame and self-doubt when reading feels hard. She's passionate about helping parents, just like I am, better understand what's happening beneath the surface of their children and creating reading experiences that feel supportive, engaging, and dignifying, right? Dignity preserving. Ruth also created the Yak Pack Comics, a decodable comic series designed to teach children to read, reconnecting them with reading, confidence, and joy. Welcome, Ruth. I am delighted to have a chance to talk with you again because you really grabbed my attention when we spoke about what I might see in the hallways of your offices on any given day. That just captured my attention. Like, all right, she gets this. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I am so happy to be here.
Great. So let's just start by me asking you this obvious question, I think. What pulled you into this work with struggling readers and what kept you here for 3 decades?
Oh my gosh, 30 years. It feels like it's gone by in a snap. It really has. What pulled me? Well, I graduated with my teacher's degree and a degree in psychology. And at that time, where I live in Toronto, in Canada, there was a hiring freeze for teachers. And I thought, well, gosh, okay, I've been spending 5 years in school and I love kids and I've worked with kids since I was a young teenager. What am I going to do next? How am I going to move forward? I decided that I would basically open shop in my own living room. So I started seeing students one-on-one in the neighborhood. They would come into my apartment. We would have tea. We would, have a little snack, and then we would get to work. At first, the cases I was getting were general cases, homework cases, things like that. But slowly I built up a reputation of working with really difficult learning situations. And the more I had difficult students, challenging students who were having challenges themselves and therefore were acting out, or, their behavior was also stressed because of that dysregulation, as we've talked about, the more I had to do research. And the further I dove into the research, the more I was just fascinated by reading, how a reading acquisition happens, what's happening in the classrooms right now versus how we're actually teaching it, and what are best practices. What I found at that time, 30 years ago, was we were really at the side of a whole language learning, which is really a lot more about memorization than it is about breaking the words down and the sounds down and giving students the tools that they need and a strong foundation. So what's kept me here, I think, is my curiosity. I am always curious to know what's happening with my students. And the more research I did and the more I could share with my students and adapt things and be curious, but also be reflective and find new ways of doing things, the more we saw success. And so, of course, the more you see success, the more you want to do something. So it's kept me here for a long time, but I'm still learning. I'm always learning, and I'm always open to the next thing that is going to work for the students that we see.
That's great. Before we talk about any of those strategies, I want to start with the heart of your work. When a child struggles to read, what is often happening emotionally that adults don't see?
I often liken it to an iceberg, where we're really only seeing the very tip. And the behavior that you're seeing, the avoidance, the frustration, the meltdowns, the overwhelm, the shutdown, that's often what a parent is going to see. You're going to see it in a defiant way. You might see it in a tearful way. You might see it in an absolute hiding way where we're literally pulling the covers over our heads because we just don't want to be there. When we see those behaviors for a parent, we feel frustrated, right? We're frustrated because we're trying to help our kids and they're not accepting it. We're also frustrated because we know that they need this reading skill to be successful and participate in community out at large. But we also feel sad sometimes as parents that we can't give them what they need and we don't quite understand. So what we're seeing is that behavior at the top, but what's going on underneath is a lot of often shame, guilt, feeling inadequate, feeling like, why does everybody else get this, but I can't get this? I also see a lot of students who feel compared to their siblings whether they are being compared or not, it's a natural thing to feel, well, my older sibling, my older brother could read and I can't, or my younger brother can read and I still can't. All of those things together, I think, make for a cocktail that can be really toxic in a family environment when it's not approached in a compassionate and loving way.
So the way you're talking, so when I hear the words shame and anxiety and then how it impacts a child, I'm thinking sort of forming a shame or negative identity that spreads, right? It starts maybe with learning difficulties, but then it becomes sort of like, this is my modus operandi. I am just not good, right? I'm bad as a shame response. Do you see that?
All the time. All the time. I cannot tell you the number of students that I have come to my office for the first time. We always do, a meet and greet first, so I get to know the student, figure out where they are, then we do the diagnostic part. But I cannot tell you the number of times I have heard, I'm a bad reader. I'm not good at reading. I'll never be good at reading. I don't even know why I bother to try because it's never going to work for me. And then, as you're saying, that starts to bleed into the rest of their lives. And if a child spends 6 to 8 hours at school every day, let's say a grade 3 child who's still not reading at grade level, they're in an environment where everybody feels to them like everybody's moving ahead, and they are feeling very stuck. That's going to impact everything that they do. It's going to impact their relationship to themselves, their relationship with their peers, the relationship with their teachers. And what I see is, as we start to kind of chip away at that story that they're telling themselves, we are able to uncover the true joy in reading, in being able to participate in class, in being able to have a different relationship with peers. I'll tell you a quick story. I was working with a student who was in grade 4, and she has still, as an adult, this is a long time ago, but has severe dyslexia and severe ADHD, and the brightest whip you could ever imagine. So bright, so articulate, so precocious, knew tons about tons of things. But reading was a real challenge. And because she was so aware of her both strengths and challenges, she really felt it quite acutely, the differences that she presented in the classroom. And when she first came in, she wouldn't pick up a book. She wouldn't pick up a pencil. She wouldn't put her pencil on the page. She just sat there with her arms crossed and said, I'm just not a reader. Not a reader. I'm not ever going to be a reader. Don't even bother to try. We worked together for about 2 years. We started right back at the beginning in terms of tracing the alphabet, making it very kinesthetic, putting it in her body so that it wasn't just about seeing symbols on a page. Lots of multimodal and multisensory activities. So we were jumping around, doing the shapes of the letters, writing them on the carpet, writing them in sand, doing as much as we could do to get that in her body. And it took about, I would say, 6 to 8 months before she started to see the difference for herself. And then a full 2 years later, by the time she was in grade 6, she was able to be reading fluently and was calling herself a reader. And there was, I think she had like a graduation around grade 8 where she was moving on to high school. And she became valedictorian of her class in grade 8. And for that valedictory speech, she actually referenced the fact that, she didn't learn to read until she was in grade 6. But that moment that she recognized herself as a reader was what changed her life and allowed her to be where she is now. Now she's probably finishing university or off onto her career or family life or something like that. But those moments of that discovery, that self-discovery, where a child finally says, or an adult finally says, oh, I am a reader. I can do this. I'm just as good as everybody else. It's like a game changer. It's a life changer because it changes their perception of themselves. It changes how they feel about themselves. And then, of course, how they take that out into the world.
Well, that's a beautiful, inspiring story, I have to say. And I was thinking, why is it that some children struggle when they are so intelligent? They are curious and creative, children. And what I think most parents would say, they're so capable. Why can't they read? I mean, I know the obvious things like dyslexia. That makes sense to me. But what about a child that doesn't end up diagnosed with dyslexia? Why would they struggle so fiercely, do you think?
I think there are a lot of reasons why a child would struggle with reading or academic in general. Number one, if we have a diagnosed learning difference, then we know that that's a brain thing. That's the way that the brain is wired. And I also want to jump back to the fact that as a society, we have been an oral society for hundreds of thousands of years. And that's the way that our brains developed originally. This idea of reading, of taking a symbol and putting it on a page and having to decipher or decode that symbol in whatever language we're talking about, but something that is written, is very new in the span of human existence. So our brains are wired orally for storytelling, for story listening, for comprehension. But the fact that we now have to really attune our brains to look at the symbol and make meaning of that symbol in recognition with other symbols and what that meaning is, and then how we interpret that and how we comprehend that, that's a new thing for the brain. So some brains are just wired differently, and it's going to take them a little bit longer to get that groove going. So that's sort of a biological base to that question. In terms of other pieces, sometimes we look at exposure at home. We know that an environment that is rich in print, that values reading, that values picking up a book and having that time and having that moment to connect with different characters, that also helps to build stronger reading skills. It's not the only thing, but it does help. And then, of course, there are lots of families where we've got really print-rich environments and parents who love reading. There are books everywhere. They've been read to since they were in the womb, and it just doesn't connect for that child. And I think finding something that makes sense to them, that they are engaged in, maybe it's humor, maybe it's not even stories as in Once Upon a Time story. It's more of nonfiction reading. Some kids actually connect much better to nonfiction, and then other kids connect much better to something that's really funny and really humorous because it just snaps their attention. So I think we have to look at also what they're reading, what they're being presented with. Is it along their interest line, or is it something that they're just not interested in, so it hasn't grabbed them yet?
Yeah, that was kind of occurring to me, that kids who have, let's say we don't know what causes it. It's not an obvious learning difference like dyslexia, but there are other things. A lot of children end up diagnosed with ADHD or autism. They may have some executive function delays, but even if that still can't really be pulled out, it seems like kids who are struggling with reading, they need something particularly different from the adults around them. And I'm not sure what that is. I think you probably know.
Well, I would say it might be comics. We can talk about that later. I think that, when a child is struggling with it, as we talked about before, there's all that shame and that guilt. And so if they can't do it easily, and we as adults feel the same way, I think if we can't do it easily, if it doesn't come naturally or quickly, often we're like, not interested, don't want to do it, don't want to waste my time, because it feels bad. It doesn't feel good to pick something up and feel confused and to feel like you don't know what you're doing and that you don't have that confidence to be able to be successful. So success breeds success. And when we work with our students, we start with very small pieces and we try and build in success from the very beginning. So after the first lesson, we want them to leave happier than when they came in. If they're leaving the session with smiles and they're bouncing and they're excited and they go back to mom and dad and say, oh, that was I had fun. I was like, I'm surprised I had fun, but I had fun. That to me is what we need to do to hook them. And then we give them the really strong, what I would call scope and sequence, where we're doing things in a very methodical way, starting at the beginning, moving step by step, mastering each step before moving on. And that therefore gives them that confidence that they can take back to the next session, and they're seeing their own progress. They're feeling their own progress. So, nobody likes to do things that are hard. But if we can break it down into small, manageable pieces, and we can show success at every step, that's how you're going to get that buy-in from your student or your child.
This is a common difficulty my listeners often have, because they're really trying to help their kids. They're loving parents trying to help their kids who are struggling in a lot of ways. What are some of the most common ways loving parents accidentally make reading feel worse, harder for kids, more pressured, more unsafe, or maybe shame-filled? What do you see?
I am so glad that you asked that question, because I think the most loving parents, the best intentioned parents and grandparents and caregivers often make these mistakes. One would be handing a child something to read that is really above their level, thinking that they can read it. And when they start struggling, say things like, "Oh, come on, you can do it. You can. I know you can do it. You know that sound. You know that word." When we tell somebody that they know something, but they don't feel that they know it or they can't remember it in the moment, oh, it's just like, that you can feel the blood rush out of you if you're put on the spot to do something that you can't in that moment produce. It doesn't feel good. Really choosing appropriate material, text that is appropriate, that is neither too hard nor too easy. Although, if you start with something a little easy, it again builds that success so they feel good about it, and then we can move to the next level. Choosing the appropriate text is my number one suggestion to a parent. Also, figuring out when is the best time to read with your child, because every child has a different circadian rhythm. Some kids do really, really well in the morning. They're with it, they're enthusiastic, they're focused. But by the time they come home after a full day of school, they're tired, they're cranky, they could be frustrated from the rest of the day. That's maybe not the best time to sit down and do a reading lesson with a child. Maybe that's the best time to do a snuggle up reading time where you're just, you're taking the lead as the parent and giving them again a page or a sentence where that they will be successful. So often at the end of the day or bedtime is not the best time to do a reading lesson, but it is a good time to bond and to share a good story. So reading time is important.
Do you have a suggestion when, say, your child just, stops and puts their hands to their forehead and they start saying, I'm just so stupid. I'm stupid. I can't figure this out. And I can't do it. What is your advice for how parents could best handle that to help them?
I think, and we experience it in our classes too. We think we're going in a good direction and we've got the buy-in, and then all of a sudden it falls apart. And there's something that triggers that student, whether it's a word that they haven't seen before, or they're just getting overwhelmed, they're getting tired, more frustrated, etc. I think that is the perfect time to kind of throw up your hands and say, okay, let's take a break. Let's just take a break. You know what? We're going to close the books. We're going to put them far over here. Let's go out and play basketball. Let's go out for a walk. Let's play with the dog. I actually suggest you move completely away from the situation for a few minutes. Let that child self-regulate again, get the cortisol levels to come down, and then find a way back into it. Because if we sit there and push and push and push, they're never going to want to come back and sit down with us again. So it's not giving up, it's just taking a break. And I think it's really important for a parent to recognize, even before you get to that breaking point, the signs, right? We know when our kids are reaching their limit. And if we can take that moment, take a deep breath and say, okay, I see that this is getting, I think we've done enough. You know what? You've done a great job. We've gotten to this point. We're going to put the bookmark in for today. We're going to come back to it. Let's go out and play without shame, without guilt.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think that's probably what you mean by dignity preserving reading support. Are there other things you would suggest right there under that heading? Because you were just talking about that. And I felt like, oh yeah, let's take a break. That's enough. You're good. Let's go play. That sounds really dignity preserving to me. Are there other kinds of dignity preserving supports?
Yes, and I love that phrase, dignity preserving, right? Because when we are doing something hard, we have to really protect ourselves as individuals, right? We will become defensive if we feel like we're being attacked. So if we can take that moment and we can, as parents, see that moment ahead of time for our child and give them the space to just be good in that moment. The other thing I think is really going back to the suggestion I made earlier, which is choosing the right material for your child. Choose something that they enjoy. And what happens with students who have reading challenges or who are behind their peers is often they are left out of the social aspect of reading what is age appropriate. And so, if your child is reading at a grade 1 level, but they're in a grade 4 classroom and their peers are reading all of these much thicker novels and they are talking about them in class, or when it comes to book report time, they're given what my students would call the babyish novel or the baby book, and their friends are getting the thick novel. That is not very dignity preserving. That doesn't feel good. So if we're looking around and we're trying to create something, an environment where a child feels as equal to their peers as they can, that's one of the steps, is to really choose something that doesn't look like a baby book and doesn't make them feel like they're stepping backwards or they're being pulled down.
Well, that's a natural segue then to what you are famous for. So tell us about the Yak Pack Comics. Why comics and why phonics? Let's go there.
My beautiful Yak Pack books. I'm so glad that I get to talk about them. So I'll show you quickly. We've got two sets. We've got a red set and we've got a blue set. And the Yak Pack Red Set has 5 books. These comics are intended to start right at the beginning of learning to read. So we're really starting with short vowel sounds. We're then moving through to digraphs, which are, 2 letters together that make one sound, like TH makes a th sound. We have another book on blends. We have another book on the bossy E, so why that silent E makes the vowel say its own name. And then we have a whole book on R-controlled vowels. So this set takes us from very beginning all the way to about a grade 2 level. Why did I create these? Because my students were struggling, and I was struggling as a teacher to find material that actually was dignity preserving. So it didn't look babyish, and it was also research based. It was based on the science of reading, which there is now decades of research based on what are best practices for reading, how does the brain acquire reading, what works best for students with learning challenges, what works best for everyone. We've created a universal design here because even though in the back of my mind I was creating these books for students with learning challenges, they're actually wonderful for anybody who is ready to read, meaning knows the first couple of sounds, and then we can get them started with the short vowels. So let me show you what we've done here, because as a teacher, I couldn't just put out a comic series. I had to make it a teaching comic series. So we have Zach the Yak, and Zach is our mascot, and he is the leader of the Yak Pack. And he has a whole bunch of wonderful, kooky, crazy, quirky friends that live in the forest with him. And they all have different names. They're all lots of different characters. They're funny. There's so much humor in them. There's a lot of movement in the pictures. So we created the actual comics with an illustrator, a comic illustrator. There is no AI here in our books whatsoever. Everything is created by hand. And we have comic panels that really preserve that scope and sequence. So we only have the words in here that a student can actually decode. And before we even get to the story, we do a little preview. I think you can see we introduce the sound for that story with a picture. So we've got something to hold on to. We have an anchor. We introduce all the words we're going to use that have that short vowel sound. And then we introduce the high frequency words. And that's really important because when you're teaching a student who is feeling either frustrated or anxious, we need to give them a heads up. So we need to practice these sounds first, and then we use them in the story. And then when the story's done, then we do a little checkout because, like I said, I'm a teacher. I can't have a story without some comprehension questions. And then we practice something called phonological awareness, which is the ability to manipulate sounds within words. And we know from research that phonological awareness is really the best predictor of reading success. So if you have this ability to blend sounds together, to hear individual sounds in words, to squeeze them together and to pull them apart, it's going to help you with your reading and with your spelling and writing of words later on. So the book was based on all of the best research and best practices and mastery, because we only do one sound at a time and one group of sounds for one book, and then we move on to the next. But it was also really made for keeping kids engaged and keeping the humor going. So the second series is our high frequency words, and we do that a little differently, still with comics, but because we're only teaching 2 high frequency words, and just in case we don't know what that is, a high frequency word are words that come up in early reading often. So they are categorized by how often they come up in beginning reading books or early reader books. And there's a Dolch list that has 200 words or more. We use that list as our guideline. So in this series of 5 books, we introduce 2 per story, and we get through 100 by the end of the 5 books. So with 100 high-frequency words, not memorizing, because memorizing actually doesn't help a lot of students who have learning challenges. We need to actually break it down and help them understand what parts of the word they know and what they don't. I'll show you a quick one. Here is the word said. The word said, for example, S-A-I-D, has 2 sounds you know. You know S and you know D. And we just need to practice the part in the middle that says but is really spelled with an AI. So we will draw that with a heart around it, and we say, that's the one you memorize by heart. The rest of it you can sound out. And the way that we've created these books is we've introduced the words, and then we use them in the story, and the words that you don't know, we show a picture. So you're still getting that idea of reading fluently, but you're only practicing the words that you need to practice. So really great to use together, the blue books and the red books. And through those 10 books, you will take your child from early reading, just knowing a few consonants, from short vowel sounds all the way to about a grade 2 level. What I love about it is that when students follow that scope and sequence and they practice and they have that mastery going forward, that confidence grows. And because these don't look babyish, they don't look like baby books, they look like graphic novels, that's what the kids are gravitating to, and they feel like they're reading something as equal to their peers.
So as you're showing me this, it feels kind of old school to me, which, I'm old and
No, you're not at all.
Yes, I am. But that's how I learned to read, is how you're saying it. And so I'm imagining that there are some other parents who are thinking that too. So how do you help parents understand like this version of learning to read when school is probably not teaching this anymore exactly this way?
So this is where I was in my practice for so many years, because when I started teaching kids to read and doing all that research and really going down the rabbit hole of what are best practices, everything was coming back to me that we need to go back to a phonics-based learning, which is learning each individual sound explicitly. Let me teach you. I'm the expert. I'm going to teach you what this sound says. You don't have to guess. You don't have to guess it from the pictures or memorize it by the shape of the letter. I'm going to teach you what this says. But that was at complete odds with what was going on in the classroom 30 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. And still around the country, around North America, there was something called the language wars, where we were looking at whole language versus phonics. And for many, many years, phonics was losing, whole language was winning. But we are discovering, and more teachers and school boards are discovering, that missing piece of phonics, especially for kids who have learning challenges, diagnosed dyslexia, or any other type of challenge with reading and academics. That best practice of phonics is actually the only thing that's going to help them bridge that gap between reading and not reading. In my own practice, I was quietly using the phonics for many, many years, and a lot of parents were confused because they were saying, well, but that's not how they're learning in school. And my answer was, but they're not learning from what they're learning in school. So we have to do something differently. And now we're seeing more and more people understand what's important about phonics and how to teach it in a structured and scope and sequence way and a masterful way. More and more teachers are getting on board with the fact that their students are actually being more successful. They're graduating more kids in grade 1 and grade 2 who are readers than they were 10 years ago using a whole language system. So I'm a big proponent of it. I've seen it for, as we said, 3 decades, and I see it every day in our own practice, that it's just an easier way for the brain to calibrate this unknown code. I mean, symbols, that's all that letters are. They're just symbols. And our English letters look different from another language letters, but every reader in whatever language has to understand what that symbol represents and how it relates to the sounds that you're going to make, and then in the bigger picture of a word. By breaking it down into its smallest pieces, we're going to get the best result.
Well, that's great. I'm a big proponent of 1% changes, right? Just little 1% shifts.
Yeah.
I love phonics myself because I can read anything. I don't have to have read it before. And that helps me. It helps me know what words mean before I even get to the end of the syllable that I'm trying to figure out.
It's interesting that you say that, because I've talked to so many, let's call them millennial parents, right? Parents who have kids who are in the early school system now, but they themselves were not taught with phonics. So those are the parents, I think, that are having the hardest time with helping their kids with their phonics work if they are doing it in class or taking a different approach because they themselves didn't learn that way. And I cannot tell you how many parents have said to me, well, I didn't learn that way. And now that I'm learning, right, how to break a word into its parts, how to look at the beginning, the prefix, and to understand, if it starts with hydro, like we were saying, if it starts with hydro, it means something to do with water, or hydra. If it starts with pre, it means something that comes before. So if we look at the parts of words and we're teaching that kind of understanding of where the words come from, a lot of parents are saying, like, light bulbs are going off and they're going, oh, that's what that means. Or I never thought about that before. Or even better, a lot of parents have said to me, now that I'm teaching my child to read using phonics, I am becoming a better reader myself. I can pick up a map and read, names of countries that I couldn't pronounce before, because I now have the skills to break that word into smaller pieces. I know what each of those sounds or combinations of sounds say, and now I can sound out the word with much more confidence than I could a year ago. So even parents are recognizing the value of teaching in this way.
Well, I think that's kind of fun. That's exciting to me. We're coming down to the end of our program today, sadly, because I'm pretty sure you could talk a long time on this topic, right? This is one of your faves, I can tell.
All day long.
So in keeping with the 1% changes, what is one small 1% shift a parent can make this week that protects both reading growth and their relationship with their child? Because that's what we're always trying to protect here is relationship.
I think that's a great question. 1%, what's one little thing that they can do? I think recognizing for your child that how they read and how they feel about reading is connected to their identity, and recognizing that we need our kids to be in a emotionally regulated state in order to be able to learn, to take the risks that we need to learn. And of course, reading takes a lot of risks. So if we're able to do that and give that environment of safety by being calm ourselves, by choosing the appropriate material, and just by being relaxed and having fun with it. Choose something that you want to read about or that the child is interested, and take turns. And remember that lesson time doesn't have to feel like a lesson. It can feel like a game. It can feel like a scavenger hunt. It can feel like, putting Scrabble tiles out on the table and just making words together. There are a number of things that a parent can do to make it fun and enjoyable that takes the pressure off of, you're going to sit here and read this word now.
I love that idea of just making words out of Scrabble tiles. I love that. Yeah. So thank you so much for being here, Ruth. You've been a lovely guest filled with lots of information and hope for my listeners. You're such a true gift to learning. I love having you here. Thank you.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you. And thank you for the amazing work that you're doing. I'm so glad that your listeners have you to come back to.
Thank you. Hey, everybody, if you're interested in the Yak Pack, it will be in the show notes. You can also contact Ruth in the show notes. You can see exactly how to do it because she does virtual work as well with kids. While I'd love to see all the play that goes on in her offices, if you don't have the opportunity to live nearby, that's okay. You can still get some support from Ruth or one of her staff members who join together to make this wonderful learning environment for kids. Again, Ruth, thank you so much. If you listeners know a parent whose child is struggling to read or learn in any way, send this episode to them. They'll appreciate your thoughtfulness. I know they will. So thank you, friends, for listening to Unmuted Love. Remember, your love matters when more than love is required. I'll see you in the next episode.